This is music notes from the Church of St. Mary the Virgin for the week of August 30, 2020. I am parishioner Sandy Stadfeld, and I'm going to be speaking about a cultural phenomenon that interests me a great deal, and that is people for whom music is not their principal livelihood or profession, but who can't exist without music. And probably the best example of that in the United States is this insurance salesman who in his time was known as a very successful life insurance salesman, as well as the creator of what we consider modern estate planning. Today, he is known as the progenitor of American classical modernist composition. His name is Charles Ives. So not many people today think of him as a great insurance salesman, but that was really his livelihood for most of his life. So the person I'm going to be speaking about today is a San Francisco native, someone who was very active in music in the 20th century, and but who is remembered not so much for that, but for a whole different field of endeavor. Our subject is Jules Eichhorn, a first-generation San Franciscan and the child of German immigrants. Growing up in the German-American community at that time steeped Jules in such traditions as spending a lot of time outdoors hiking and in family and community music making. So after a childhood during which he and his family were regular hikers on the slopes of Mount Tamalpais, by his teenage years, Jules was an annual participant in the Sierra Club high trips, during which the Sierra Club took large groups camping and hiking throughout the Sierra Nevada. By 1931, Jules was part of a group of climbers who trained in alpine roped climbing techniques and was part of a number of notable first descents and explorations of previously inaccessible slopes. With this expertise, in 1933, Jules was recruited to a climbing party with a much sadder mission, but it was that participation that ultimately enabled him to pursue his education and career as a music teacher. Jules Eichhorn was recruited to a group that was to be engaged in a search for Walter A. Starr Jr., or Pete Starr. Pete Starr was in his own right, an explorer and mountaineer at this time, and regularly traveled solo in the mountains for weeks at a time. He was also working at this time on a guidebook that became the central and essential guide to what would become the John Muir Trail. This book is still published by the Sierra Club and is actually a terrific reference to all the trails that connect with the John Muir. He was a native of Piedmont and had graduated from Stanford and Stanford Law School, and only recently begun practice of law with a firm in San Francisco. One Monday morning, he didn't show up for work, and when that morning grew into a week, both his colleagues and his family grew very, very concerned and organized a search party to explore the area of the minarets and look for any sign of his whereabouts. This gives you an idea of where the minarets are located, south of Yosemite National Park and just northwest of Mammoth Lakes. It's an area that is pretty heavily trafficked today and is pretty accessible today, but in 1933 it was off the beaten track and a very rugged part of the Sierra. This is a photograph of the east face of the minarets, showing just how precipitous they are and remote, really accessible only to the most competent climbers. We have to remember too that Pete Starr climbed just as we saw him in that photograph preceding, alone, with no fixed protection, no rope, and wearing rubber-soled gym shoes. These are four of the climbers that were recruited to the search for Pete Starr in 1933 in the minarets. They constitute what was generally considered the A-team of Sierra Alpine climbers in the early 1930s. This photograph, in fact, was taken on the summit of Mount Whitney immediately after these four had completed the first successful ascent of Whitney's imposing east face. On the far left is Glenn Dawson, who in 1931 was 17 years old. He and Eichhorn had already, in 3 years, completed many notable climbs throughout the Sierra. Glenn Dawson, together with his brother, would go on to become best known as book dealers in Los Angeles. Robert Underhill was a little older, at this point was early in his career as a professor of philosophy at Harvard, but he was the one credited with bringing Alpine techniques to the Sierra and passing them on to a much broader population of climbers. Finally, on the far right, Norman Clyde is unusual amongst this group in that he was much older and that he did nothing but climb. In fact, Norman Clyde has more successful first ascents to his credit than any other climber in the history of the Sierra. The search for Pete Starr focused on Michael Minaret, the peak you see here on the right. A number of clues that were found in Starr's abandoned camp and some conversations that apparently occurred with others in the area indicated that he was headed in the direction of this summit. Jules Eichhorn and Norman Clyde were partnered in the search for Pete Starr on Michael Minaret. After several fruitless days, they were down climbing from near the summit and noticed a ledge to their right on which lay the body of Pete Starr. They made a difficult traverse to that ledge and discovered that Starr had fallen after a granite handhold had broken from the face of the mountain and fallen with him to that point. They recovered some artifacts from Starr's body and took them back down the mountain to demonstrate to Starr's father that they had in fact found him and where he had fallen on the mountain. The Starr family then made the decision not to ask Eichhorn and Clyde to bring the body down, but instead to return to the ledge and entomb their son on the face of Michael Minaret. Having completed this commission, Jules Eichhorn and Norman Clyde were awarded financial support from the Starr family to complete their personal goals. For Norman Clyde, that goal was simple. He wished only to remain in the mountains and to guide, to climb, and to write about his experiences indefinitely. The Starr family set him up with an indefinite stipend to enable him to fulfill that goal. Jules Eichhorn's goal was to attend college, major in music, and become a music teacher. The Starr family paid for Jules Eichhorn's tuition at UC Berkeley and ensured that he attained that goal. He went on to spend many decades as a teacher in the San Mateo High School district, teaching decades of band students. In fact, many students of Jules Eichhorn knew him only as their band director and knew nothing of his illustrious career as a mountaineer in the Sierra. This is the plaque that was placed on Michael Minaret in 2003 to commemorate the life and contributions of Pete Starr to Sierra mountaineering. An interesting coincidence of this story is that Jules Eichhorn, who's pictured on the left here, originally started studying piano about age 10 with a gentleman on the right, whom you may recognize as photographer Ansel Adams. Adams also grew up in San Francisco, living out in what is now Seacliff. He had intended to become a concert pianist and trained for that until discovering that his hands simply didn't grow large enough to play a lot of the repertoire he would be expected to perform. So he had turned instead to photography, and in fact, Jules Eichhorn worked as his assistant for some years to pay for his continuing music lessons. This photograph on the left is a portrait of Jules Eichhorn taken by Ansel Adams about 1932. Jules Eichhorn has been commemorated by a number of geographic features throughout the Sierra and beyond. The photograph on the left is of Eichhorn Pinnacle, a spire that rises from the north part of Cathedral Peak in Yosemite National Park, and it's another summit of which Eichhorn made the first successful ascent. On the right is a photograph of Jules Eichhorn in the late 1970s up in the Minarets, but at a time when he was still teaching high school music. I'm always on the lookout for people who might have gone to school in the San Mateo High School district and might have been in Eichhorn's band. So far, I've only met one person who was genuinely shocked to learn about Jules Eichhorn's other career as a mountaineer. Finally, this is the last photograph I could find of Jules Eichhorn toward the end of his life at his home in Redwood City. I'm always interested in stories of the role music plays in the lives of people who aren't musicians as a profession. And this is one. I learned a lot about the importance of music, for example, to the Sierra Club outings in their early days, wherein musical and theatrical performances were just part of the exercise of being in the mountains together. If you know of similar stories, please let me know. I find them really interesting and inspiring, and I wish you great music and great climbing. Thank you.